If you love stories where humans shock the galaxy, where councils tremble and predators bow to no one, except a human, then you're in the right place. Don't forget to like this story, drop a comment on what you'd do if a predator cub trusted you, and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this galactic saga. Now let's begin. The chamber of the Galactic Council was never silent, not even during judgment. Crystalline pillars hummed with low resonance, a vibration felt in the bones of every being seated in the circle. The delegates, scaled, feathered, furred, and mechanical, shifted uneasily as the latest report streamed across the vaulted projection dome above them. A colony world, marked insignificant on the frontier, flickered into view, Harrow Vale. Lush forests, knife-edged mountains, and cloud seas that rolled like tides of silver. A paradise in appearance, but known for one terrible truth. It was home to the Verka. Every species in the chamber stiffened at the name. The apex of all apex predators, a beast that had never been tamed, not even in cub form. Their hides could shrug off blades, their jaws could splinter armor, and their instincts made them recoil from the presence of any intelligent life. Races had tried before, bonding, breeding, bending their cubs into service, and those attempts ended with shredded handlers and silent forests painted in blood. To see one was to face an ancient nightmare. And yet, the report was undeniable. Cub after cub, not just tolerating humans but curling beside them in sleep, pawing at them in play, feeding from their hands. The chamber resounded with a discordant chorus of disbelief. "This is fabrication," hissed Counselor Threx, a mantid whose mandibles clicked in agitation. "Some crude visual manipulation, a primitive trick." "No," the voice of Elder Zyrian slithered low, heavy with cold certainty. His serpentine form uncoiled across his dais, scales catching the glow of the chamber lights. He was among the oldest of them, and the sharpest memory of failed hunts burned within him. "I have seen the uncut feats. The predators are not coerced. They are choosing." "Impossible," another spat. "No predator, least of all the Verka, lowers its head to prey." But the vision looping above their heads betrayed their denial. A man, tall but weathered, stood in a clearing beneath the shade of Harrow Vale's titanic trees. His hair was streaked with silver, his jaw carved from years of war and wilderness. He did not wield whips, nor cages, nor the genetic tamperings others had tried. He merely stood, calm and steady, as two predator cubs circled him with the curiosity of children. They were deadly even at that age, claws like daggers, teeth glinting with promise of ruin, yet they pawed at his boots, tugged at his coat, and received from him nothing but patient stillness. The chamber gasped as one cub reared onto its hind legs, resting forepaws on his chest. Rather than strike or recoil, the man lowered a hand and scratched behind its ear. The cub's eyes, gold and burning, softened. It leaned into his touch with a rumble that was not a growl but something stranger, something no counselor could name. "By the stars," whispered a delegate whose people had lost whole provinces to those predators centuries ago. "He treats it as though it were a pup." Debate erupted instantly, voices colliding like storms. Some demanded the humans be investigated for forbidden sciences. Others insisted the cubs be seized before they matured into weapons no council could control. The idea of predators aligning themselves with a newly risen species, one so young, so untested, threatened the very order of the galaxy. But Elder Zyrian raised a clawed hand, and the chamber reluctantly stilled. His narrow eyes gleamed as he studied the man in the projection. He does not command them. He does not break them. He does not fear them. David Hale has done what no species has ever managed. He has been accepted. The name, so ordinary in human tongue, carried an almost heretical weight here. The chamber's lower tiers stirred again, this time with unease rather than argument. "Then we must act," Threx insisted, voice sharp as splintered glass. "If predators answer to humans, then humans will rise with predators at their side. What balance can withstand such a union?" "Send hunters," another agreed. "Erase the cubs before they grow. Erase the humans who dare shelter them." Zyrian's tongue flickered, tasting the air of dissent. His voice slid through the chamber like a blade through silk. "No. If we kill them we learn nothing. Let us send watchers as well. Let us see if this is anomaly, or destiny." High above, the projection shifted once more. This time the feed drew closer to the man's face, weather-lined yet composed. A gaze that belonged not to prey but to something far older, something that knew patience, scars and fire. He crouched to the level of the cubs, murmuring in a tongue the translators struggled to catch. Earth words, meaningless to most of the galaxy but steady and gentle. The cubs listened, ears twitching, tails flicking in rhythm. Then, before all gathered eyes, one cub sprawled against the forest floor, rolled onto its back and exposed its armored belly. The ultimate gesture of trust among the Verka, a thing only ever given to its mother. The silence in the chamber was absolute. Even the pillars ceased their hum, as if the galaxy itself had inhaled and forgotten to exhale. Elder Zyrian broke it with a single final sentence. The predators have chosen. And they have chosen humans first. The words rippled like a shockwave. For the first time in living memory, the council trembled not at the predators themselves, but at the species they had bowed to. And on Harrow Vale, unaware of the storm gathering above the stars, David Hale stood in the clearing as the cubs pressed closer, and the forest around him seemed to hold its breath. The forests of Harrow Vale did not give gifts easily. Storms raged without warning, rivers swelled overnight to devour entire valleys, and the predators that prowled beneath the towering trees spared no life foolish enough to stumble unguarded. David Hale had known all this when he chose the planet for exile. He had wanted solitude, silence, and the stubborn honesty of a wilderness that did not care whether he lived or died. What he had not expected was to find her. The Verka matriarch lay half-hidden in a grove, flank torn open by a hunter's plasma bolt. Blood black as oil steamed against the cold soil, and her breathing rattled like a collapsing furnace. David had stumbled across her trail while scouting game. His first instinct had been the soldier's reflex: draw, aim, end the threat. Every story whispered about her kind called for it. But when he raised the rifle, his finger froze on the trigger. The predator's golden eyes did not flare with rage. They were dulled, dimming, and locked on two cubs trembling at her side. David lowered the rifle. The storm that day tore across the valley, sheets of rain drowning even the sound of his own heartbeat. He built a fire under the roots of an uprooted tree, dragged the predator closer despite her weight, and worked on her wound with the same calm he had once given dying men in the trenches. The cubs hissed and snapped at first, tiny jaws already strong enough to bruise bone, but his stillness never faltered. He spoke to them as though they were children who understood, and in time, their snarls broke into exhausted whimpers. That night, the cubs pressed against their mother's ribs for warmth, but their eyes strayed toward the man who kept the fire alive. When lightning split the sky, one crept closer and curled beside his boot. David said nothing, only pulled his coat around them both and kept watch until morning. It should have ended there. The matriarch recovered enough to stand within a fortnight. David expected her to take her cubs and vanish into the deep forest. But on the day she rose, she turned her head toward him, not with the contempt predators usually reserved for lesser beings, but with something heavier. Her muzzle touched the ground in front of his feet, a gesture so alien and yet unmistakable. Then, with a guttural growl, she pushed her cubs toward him. She left them there. David tried to refuse. He followed the matriarch's fading trail for miles, but the forest swallowed her. The cubs trailed after him instead, nipping at his boots, mewling with the insistence of orphans who had made their choice. In the end, he accepted because he had no other option. He was not their master. He was the one they had been entrusted to. Life changed. Hunts that once ended with him dragging a carcass through mud now became lessons. The cubs learned quickly, imitating his crouches, his patient stillness before the strike. They brought him offerings, half-dead hares, shattered fowl, until he taught them the clean kill. At night they sprawled beside him, their growls lulling him to sleep as surely as rain on a cabin roof. It was then that Elias Carter entered his life. The younger man arrived one morning with a coil of wire over his shoulder and exasperation in his voice. "You planning to raise those monsters in the open, old man? Or are you just hoping one day they'll eat you so you can stop chopping wood?" David did not look up from the snare he was repairing. The cubs, now the size of mastiffs, prowled in slow arcs around Elias, eyes glowing like molten gold. Elias kept his shotgun slung but his hands loose. He wasn't a fool. "They've had the chance," David said simply. Elias snorted, half in disbelief, half in awe. "Galaxy's most dangerous predators and you've got them nipping at your boots like sheepdogs. Figures it'd be a human who pulls that off." Despite his words, Elias began visiting more often. He helped mend fences, reinforced the cabin walls, and taught the cubs to fetch lengths of timber when storms brought trees down across the paths. He treated it all as a joke, but the way he lingered when the cubs pressed against him betrayed something else. Wonder, maybe even respect. One evening, as twilight poured like violet ink across the forest, David watched Elias scratching the larger cub beneath its jaw. The beast closed its eyes and leaned into the touch. Elias shook his head slowly. "Back home, the council broadcasts say these things are death incarnate. can't be reasoned with, can't be trusted. But here you are raising them like stray dogs. You know what this means, don't you? David stirred the fire, the flames painting his scarred face in flickers of orange. It means the council's wrong. Or maybe it means we're different. You think the galaxy's just going to accept that? No, David admitted. And that's the problem. Far above them, cloaked drones hovered in silence, recording every word, every gesture. The council's watchers had arrived, though neither man knew it yet. They transmitted images of cubs sprawled against human laps, of predators licking blood from David's wounded hand without turning on him, of creatures bred by nature to resist every leash, choosing instead to follow. The footage reached the council faster than any rumor. Hunters were already sharpening their weapons, preparing their descent. To them, predators allied with humans represented not curiosity but heresy. A violation of balance. A danger that must be destroyed before it rooted itself too deeply. But that night, around the fire, David only listened to the forest. He had begun to recognize the difference between silence born of safety and silence born of stalking. The woods felt restless. He drew the cubs closer, their low rumbles vibrating against his ribs. Elias watched him, unease flickering in his eyes, but said nothing. The storm was coming. Neither man could see the shadows gathering beyond the stars, but both felt it in the marrow of their bones. And when it arrived, they would no longer be merely caretakers of cubs. They would be guardians of something the galaxy had already declared impossible. The night carried a different silence. David Hale had spent enough years in the wild to know when the forest breathed evenly and when it held its breath. Tonight the air itself seemed to tighten. Leaves hung heavy, the insects muted their chorus, and even the wind withdrew from the valley. The cubs stirred uneasily around the cabin, their ears twitching toward shadows that had no scent. Elias noticed it too. He leaned against the doorway, rifle balanced across his arms, eyes scanning the treeline. Feels like the woods are waiting for something, he muttered. David's gaze never left the dark. They're not waiting. They're hiding. The hunters arrived without sound but not without presence. Cloaked in armor woven from light-dampening alloys, they moved through the underbrush like extensions of the night. Their weapons gleamed only when starlight dared to touch the edges of plasma spear tips. These were not soldiers of mercy. They were specialists bred across generations, each carrying the oath of exterminating predators before they could ever tip the balance of the galaxy again. The Watchers' drones drifted above, recording every angle. For the Council, this was not merely a mission. It was evidence, proof that humanity's anomaly would collapse under the weight of inevitability. The first shot shattered the stillness. A lance of searing blue tore through the underbrush, slamming into the cabin's outer wall. Wood splintered, smoke curling from charred grooves. The cubs snarled instantly, their throats rolling thunder into the night. David pushed them back with a hand, his other already gripping the rifle propped by the hearth. Elias dove behind the doorway, snapping the breech open and slamming shells into place. "They're here," David said, calm but certain. Figures emerged between trees, their outlines flickering against the shimmer of their cloaks. At least half a dozen. Hunters never struck without overwhelming certainty. David's mind traced the battlefield as though he were back in the service. Angles of fire, lines of sight, weaknesses in terrain. But unlike war, this fight carried a different weight. The cubs pressed against his legs, trembling not from fear but fury, their instincts already flaring for combat. Another bolt screamed across the clearing. David ducked, shouldering his rifle, and returned fire. The sharp crack of old earth steel echoed unnaturally loud against the thrum of alien energy weapons. One hunter staggered back, armor cracked. It wasn't a kill shot, but it was a warning. Elias shouted from the cabin's flank, "Two circling left." He fired, sparks bursting against armored plating, forcing them into cover. The cubs broke free of David's hold, darting across the clearing with shocking speed. Their growls sliced through the night as they collided with the nearest hunter, claws skittering against composite plating. One latched onto a gauntlet, teeth sinking until the armor shrieked under the pressure. The hunter cursed in a guttural alien tongue, raising his weapon to strike, but David was already there. He threw his shoulder into the alien, knocking the aim wide. Plasma scorched past his cheek, the heat singing flesh. He drove his knife, steel against synth bone, into the hunter's exposed joint. The alien collapsed, but David felt the cub's hot breath at his side, the beast standing with him rather than against him. The battle stretched into a brutal rhythm. Hunters advanced in calculated sweeps, their discipline undeniable, yet every maneuver was broken by an unaccounted variable. The The predators fought not alone, not in wild frenzy, but alongside the humans. The cubs mirrored David's movements, cutting flanks where he aimed, snarling warnings when bolts streaked from blind angles. They weren't pets. They were soldiers. From above, the council's drones captured it all. Counselors who had predicted the humans' deaths watched instead as hunters, trained through centuries of ritual, armed with the finest technology, were driven back by cubs barely grown and two men who refused to break. One hunter broke formation, desperate. He raised his weapon at the smaller cub, pinning it against a fallen tree. Time slowed as the crackle of charging plasma filled the air. David didn't think. He threw himself between the shot and the cub, his old combat shield snapping into place at the last possible instant. The blast slammed into him, driving him to his knees. Pain flared white-hot through his arm, but he held. Behind him, the cub's cry was not of fear but of rage. With a roar, it launched over him, claws sinking into the hunter's throat. Armor cracked, sparks sprayed, and the alien fell silent beneath the predator's weight. David, panting through gritted teeth, reached up to touch the cub's muzzle. Blood, its own and its enemies', spattered its fur, yet when his hand brushed its jaw, it leaned into him as though seeking comfort. "Easy now," he whispered, voice ragged. "You're safe with me." The words carried beyond the battlefield. Drones zoomed on the image of a human shielding a predator shielding a human in turn. The paradox struck deeper than any weapon. The remaining hunters hesitated, their formation broken. For the first time, uncertainty crept into their precision. Elias saw it. He fired a warning shot into the ground at their feet, his voice carrying sharp across the night. "You came hunting cubs. You'll leave hunted yourselves if you stay." The hunters withdrew slowly, dragging their fallen with them, disappearing back into the cloak of the forest. Their mission was unfinished, but survival now outweighed pride. Silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It was heavier, filled with the echo of what had been witnessed. The cubs paced around David, their growls soft, protective, their golden eyes fixed on him with a loyalty no council had ever believed possible. Elias crouched beside him, laying a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You realize what just happened?" Elias said, voice hushed but fierce. "Those beasts fought with you for you. The council's whole history says that can't be done. And we just proved it can." David, still on his knees, met the cub's gaze. The young predator licked blood from his hand, not as a beast tasting prey, but as one creature reassuring another. Somewhere in the skies above, the drones retreated to relay the impossible truth. The council had demanded proof. Now they had it. David rose slowly, pain flaring through his side, but his voice was steady. "They won't stop here. They'll come harder next time." Elias looked out into the forest, where shadows whispered of more battles to come. The cubs pressed against their legs as though already prepared to fight again. David's hand rested on one cub's neck, fingers sinking into the thick fur. "Then we'll fight harder too." The forest exhaled at last, the weight of silence lifting, but only for the briefest moment. Because the truth had already reached the stars. And the stars would answer. The summons came not as a request but as a demand. One moment David and Elias stood beneath Harrow Vale's ironwoods, the cubs prowling close at their heels, and the next the clearing shimmered with a lattice of light. A transport beam, impossible to resist, wrapped around them. The cubs snarled, claws carving into the soil, but David raised a calming hand. In the next breath the forest was gone. They stood in the chamber of the Galactic Council. Vast, tiered walls of polished stone rose into shadow, filled with the shapes of 100 species. Their voices, low and venomous, merged into a storm of outrage. The cubs pressed against David and Elias, tails rigid, eyes darting across the chamber at the predator's oldest enemies. Elder Zyrian coiled across his dais, scales glittering in cold light. His voice rolled like gravel dragged across steel. "Human, you stand accused of meddling with forces beyond your place. Speak, and know the weight of your words will decide more than your life." David's eyes swept the chamber once. He recognized no faces, yet the hostility was plain. He felt Elias at his side, tense but steady, and the cubs leaning against his boots as though drawing strength from his presence. He did not flinch. "I didn't bend them. I didn't break them. I treated them with respect. That's all." Laughter erupted, harsh and bitter. A counselor with a beaked face slammed a talon against the stone. "Respect? Do you think these beasts understand such a word? They were made for slaughter." The cub nearest David gave a low growl, teeth bared toward the interruption. A ripple of unease passed through the assembly. Never in recorded history had a predator defended a lesser being. Xyrian's gaze sharpened. Do not lie. You use technology hidden from us. Genetic tampering, psychic intrusion. What is your secret? There is no secret, David replied evenly. I sat with them. I fed them. I didn't treat them like monsters. You call that impossible, but maybe the truth is you never tried. Elias spoke then, his voice carrying a defiance that belied his youth. You've ruled for centuries with fear of these creatures as your excuse. You hunt them to prove your strength. And now you see a man and 2 cubs break your rules and you call it heresy. Maybe the problem isn't with the predators. Maybe it's with you. The chamber erupted. Shouts, threats, demands for silence crashed together like thunder. Guards stepped forward, weapons humming. The cubs bristled instantly, lips peeling back in a snarl that echoed like a storm breaking through the chamber's vaulted ceiling. And then the moment no counselor thought possible arrived. One cub, eyes burning gold, padded forward across the marble floor. Its claws clicked, echoing through the chamber as hundreds of alien eyes tracked its every step. It stopped in front of David, yawned, and lowered its head into his lap as though they were alone beside the cabin fire. Gasps tore from every tier. Delegates recoiled, some covering their faces, others clawing at the edges of their seats as if the vision alone would devour them. The other cub followed, pressing against Elias's boots, curling its massive frame around him with the devotion of a hound. This is blasphemy, shrieked one counselor, voice cracking with fear. Predators bow to no one, not even to their kind. But the truth stood before them, undeniable, and it was not blasphemy. It was choice. Xyrian's coils shifted restlessly, though his gaze never wavered from David. Understand the danger you represent. If predators bend their necks to humans, your kind becomes a power the galaxy cannot contain. Entire systems may fall in line behind your shadow. David's hand rested lightly on the cub's neck, fingers brushing through fur dense as armor. We didn't ask for power. We didn't seek it. But they trusted us. You can call it danger if you like. I call it trust earned, not taken. The chamber split into factions, their voices clashing like steel. Some demanded extermination before this infection spread. Others whispered of opportunities, alliances, even reverence. The galaxy's order trembled on the knife edge of one man and 2 cubs who refused to obey precedent. Guards advanced again, spears crackling with energy. The cubs rose at once, hackles raised, growls deep enough to shake the pillars. The sound forced even the guards back a step. David stood slowly, eyes locked on Xyrian, his voice carrying with steady weight. You can kill me. You can try to kill them. But what you've seen today can't be undone. They chose us first. And the galaxy knows it now. Xyrian's stare was unreadable, but the counselor's silence was more dangerous than rage. For in silence, calculation was born. The chamber lights dimmed as if the room itself recoiled from the truth it had witnessed. The cubs pressed close again, their loyalty unshaken, their presence a living contradiction of every law written in the council's history. David placed a hand on Elias's shoulder, steadying him against the storm of eyes. Whatever happens next, he said softly, we face it together. The cubs growled in unison as though echoing his promise. Above them the council's vote loomed. Condemnation or concession, exile or execution, war or something far stranger. But the decision would not erase the moment burned into memory, the first time predator cubs chose to rest their heads in a human's lap while the galaxy watched. The chamber had seen history bend. And it knew with cold certainty that it would never bend back. The chamber had fallen into silence, but it was the kind that quivered on the edge of violence. 100 species weighed their futures in the space between breaths, staring at one man, one youth, and 2 predator cubs who refused to bow to the fear carved into centuries of law. Elder Xyrian's coils shifted slowly, the sheen of his scales catching the light like a blade half-drawn. His voice came soft, almost intimate, yet laced with the thread of a noose. The council must decide. Extermination may preserve order, but... His gaze lingered on David, on the cub's head nestled against his lap. Perhaps order itself is already broken. Murmurs rippled. Some counselors leaned forward with hungry eyes, others recoiled, clutching at robes as though the sight of cubs beside men poisoned their very blood. The guards still circled, weapons raised but hesitant, their courage tested against growls deep as thunder. David rose to his feet, the cubs mirroring his movement as if tethered to his will. He met the gaze of every elder he could, steady, unyielding. You call them beasts, weapons, monsters. But tell me, how many of you have seen them like this? Not hunting, not fighting, just choosing to trust? You spent centuries killing what you feared. We spent days sitting beside what you feared. That is the only difference. Elias stepped forward then, not as a boy but as a voice sharpened by the moment. You speak of balance and safety, but what you're afraid of isn't them. You're afraid of us. Because if predators choose to trust humans first, then your fear has no more power. The words cut through the chamber like lightning through a storm. Counselors recoiled, some snarling, others whispering, but none could deny what their eyes had seen. Xyrian uncoiled fully, his immense form rising above all. Do not mistake their choice as your triumph, human. You stand on the brink of war. Entire fleets may burn to erase what you represent. David did not flinch. His hand rested gently on the cub's back, steadying its trembling as the tension in the chamber grew thick as iron. Then fleets will burn trying to kill something that already exists. You cannot unmake trust. You cannot erase what every being here has witnessed. The question you should be asking isn't how to kill us. It's how to live with what comes next. A heavy silence followed, broken only by the cub's steady breathing. At last, a counselor from the lower tiers, a feathered being whose species had long been hunted by predators, rose. Her voice trembled but carried across the chamber. For ages we've feared them. For ages we've let fear guide every law. But if predators trust humans, perhaps it is not the end. Perhaps it is the beginning. Shock spread like wildfire. A counselor siding with the humans was unheard of. But her courage cracked the dam. Others began to speak, tentative, halting. Some argued for alliances, some demanded study, and a few even saw the potential for unity rather than destruction. Yet not all bent. From the high tiers, a warlord counselor slammed a fist against stone, his voice dripping venom. This is a trick. A weakness in the predators that must be purged. If humans can tame them, then humans are more dangerous than the beasts themselves. Exterminate both before the infection spreads. Guards surged forward, hesitation burned away by the order. The chamber filled with the rising hum of weapons. The cubs roared, their cries shaking dust from the high arches. Elias pressed back against David, eyes wide but steady, while David's hand tightened on the hilt of the knife still strapped to his belt. Primitive against the council's weapons, yes, but it was all he had. And then the predators came. From the shadows above the chamber's arches, from the tunnels carved deep into the council's fortress, massive shapes emerged. Not cubs this time, but full-grown predators, eyes glowing with an ancient light. Their claws clicked against stone as they descended, silent but overwhelming. The chamber froze. Even the guards faltered, weapons trembling. The predators did not strike. They formed a ring around David, Elias, and the cubs, their hulking frames standing like living walls. And then, one by one, they lowered their heads, not to each other, not to the council, but to the man and boy at the circle's center. The chamber broke into chaos. Cries of disbelief, screams of terror, shouts of sacrilege. Yet no one dared to move. The predators had made their choice visible to all, and it was not one the council could command or contain. Xyrian's eyes burned, his voice straining against centuries of certainty unraveling before him. This cannot be. Predators bow to nothing. David's voice cut through, quiet but absolute. They bow to trust. Something your council never understood. The weight of the moment crushed the chamber into stillness again. Predators, the galaxy's eternal terror, had shown their allegiance not to the mighty, not to the council, but to humanity. Every law, every fear, every tradition cracked beneath that truth. At last, Xyrian coiled back, his tone no longer thunder but resignation edged with awe. So the age turns. The galaxy will not remain the same. His eyes narrowed, voice darkening again. But know this, human, what you have begun cannot be controlled. Trust is dangerous. Dangerous even to those who wield it. David met his gaze without blinking. Then we'll live with the danger. Because it's better than living with fear. The council did not vote. They did not condemn. They did not bless. They sat in silence as history wrote itself without their permission. For the first time, power shifted not by decree, but by the simple will of creatures who chose differently. David felt Elias's hand grip his arm, steady and firm, and the cubs pressed against them both, growling low but no longer afraid. Around them, predators stood like guardians, their presence a warning and a promise. As the chamber lights dimmed, David knew nothing was finished. Alliances would fracture, wars would rise, and danger would follow them through every star. But he also knew that the galaxy had seen the impossible, and once seen it could never be unseen. They had come to judge a man. Instead, they had witnessed the first bond of trust between predator and human, and it had rewritten the universe. And in that moment, with the weight of the council's silence pressing down, David smiled faintly and whispered to Elias. Looks like we just gave them something new to fear. The cubs purred, the predators rumbled, and the galaxy itself seemed to hold its breath as the curtain closed on the old order.